The lantern light flickered against the wooden walls, casting long shadows that swayed with every shift of the wind. Outside, the night was still, broken only by the cry of a lone coyote across the plains. The small cabin sat on the edge of town, half forgotten by most, but alive now with a silence that carried more weight than a room full of voices. He stood by the window, his hand pressed against the sill, staring into the darkness as though the horizon might give him the answers his restless heart could not. His chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm, not from labor, but from the battle waged within himself. Behind him, her footsteps were soft against the wooden floor, steady yet uncertain, like a rhythm trying to find its place in a song. She carried no weapon, no armor, nothing but her presence, and yet she felt more dangerous to him than a pistol pointed at his chest. When she stopped near the table, the air seemed to grow heavier, the weight of what was unspoken filling every corner of the room. His hands, calloused and strong from years of hard work on the land, now trembled as he tried to steady them at his side. The West had taught him to face storms head-on, to stand unyielding against men who came with hatred in their eyes, but this moment felt different. There was no enemy to draw steel against, no duel to settle. There was only her and the quiet, steady way she looked at him as though she could see beyond the scars, the dust. The years of carrying burdens too heavy for one man alone. He wanted to speak, to say something that would break the tension building between them, but the words stayed trapped. His throat felt dry, as if the desert itself had stolen the moisture from his body. Instead, he turned slightly, catching her face in the dim glow. There was strength there, but also fragility, a quiet sorrow mixed with hope. It was the kind of look that could undo a man without a single word spoken. She reached up, brushing her hair back with a motion so simple, yet so disarming it left him shaken. Her eyes didn't waver, though he saw a storm in them, the kind of storm that promised both ruin and renewal. She moved closer, and he could feel the warmth of her presence before she even touched him. The fire in the hearth crackled, as though it too recognized the moment for what it was, a crossing of lines, a step into unknown territory. He remembered the first time he saw her, weeks ago, standing in the dusty street while the sun burned overhead. She had carried herself with a grace that didn't belong to the harshness of the land, yet her eyes told a story of loss, of battles fought and endured. He had kept his distance then, knowing that getting close meant stirring up things he had buried long ago. But fate has a way of pushing people together when they least expect it, and here she was now, only a breath away. Her hand reached for the string at her shoulder, fingers steady though her chest rose with quiet breaths. He felt his stomach tighten, not out of desire alone, but out of fear of what this moment could change. His world had been built on control, on keeping feelings locked away where no one could reach them. But as he watched her, he felt those walls crumble, one stone at a time. His hands clenched at his sides, the tremor in them betraying the storm inside. The night outside grew darker, the sky heavy with clouds that swallowed the stars. Inside, the space between them seemed to shrink with each passing second. He thought of the vows he once made, the promises he kept to himself never to let his heart wander into dangerous places again. Yet here he was, on the edge of a choice that could rewrite everything he thought he knew about himself. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze never leaving his. There was no mockery, no trick, only honesty and something deeper that left him raw. His breath caught in his chest as she pulled at the fabric, the sound of it soft but louder than the wind outside. His knees felt unsteady, and for a moment he thought he might falter. His hands reached out, not to touch her, but to steady himself, as if the very air had betrayed him. The silence between them was deafening now, filled with all the questions neither dared to ask. His heart pounded so hard it threatened to echo in the small cabin, and his lips parted though words refused to come. Instead, all he managed was a whisper, a plea that escaped him before he could stop it. God help me. He hadn't meant to say it aloud, but the weight of the moment tore it from him. He wasn't sure if he was asking for strength, for forgiveness, or for a way out. All he knew was that the path ahead would not leave him unchanged. Her hand froze for a moment, her breath catching as though his words had pierced her as deeply as they had escaped him. She looked at him then, truly looked, and something in her expression softened, as if she too understood the gravity of what lay between them. The wind outside rose suddenly, rattling the windows, carrying with it the scent of dust and rain. The cabin seemed smaller, the world closing in on the two of them. His trembling hands now rested on the edge of the table, gripping it as though it were the only thing keeping him from being swept away. He knew that whatever happened next would test more than his will. It would test the very core of who he was, what he believed, and whether he could carry the weight of choices that might follow him for the rest of his days. And though the storm outside raged, the greater storm was inside him, tearing through everything he thought he had buried. The lantern flickered again, casting her face in a glow that made her look almost unearthly. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Instead, she stepped closer, the distance between them vanishing until he could feel the brush of her breath. His chest tightened, his heart pounding louder than the thunder rolling across the plains. His hands trembled again, harder this time, as he realized there was no turning back. And yet, before he could decide what to do, before he could gather the strength to either step forward or step away, she made her move, one that would change everything. The night held its breath, and so did he, as the moment hung suspended, fragile and unbroken. What happened next would decide not only the course of that night, but the course of their lives. And in the silence, the only sound was the racing of his heart, waiting for the answer he feared and longed for all at once. The night pressed against the walls of the cabin as though it meant to squeeze the life out of the small room. He stood frozen, his chest heavy, his hands gripping the table with all the strength he could muster. The lantern burned low, casting a soft glow across her face, and in that dim light she looked both fragile and unyielding, like the land itself. She had stepped so close that the warmth of her presence sank into his skin, but he held still, afraid that even the smallest move would break the fragile balance holding them there. His whisper hung in the air, heavier than the smoke curling up from the hearth. God help me. Those words were more than fear, they were confession. They betrayed the truth he had tried to bury since the day she first walked into his life. He didn't mean to feel this way. He didn't mean to want something so badly that it made his hands tremble. But one had a way of slipping past walls, and here it was now, staring him down with no mercy. Her eyes studied him with quiet intensity, like she was searching for something behind his guarded expression. And maybe she was, because she hadn't come to this place, hadn't stepped into his cabin, to turn back at the first sign of resistance. She carried her own weight, her own grief, and it showed in the lines around her eyes, in the shadows that lingered even when she smiled. He had seen enough sorrow in his years to recognize it in another. But what unsettled him most was how her sorrow and his seemed to fit together like two broken pieces of the same glass. The storm outside deepened, wind rattling the shutters, thunder rolling in the distance. He knew he should say something, tell her to stop, to turn back before either of them went any further into this dangerous ground. Yet the words refused to form. His heart betrayed him, beating faster as if urging him forward, while his mind fought to keep him rooted in place. She finally spoke, her voice soft but steady, carrying more weight than a shout could have. "You don't have to fight me." The words struck him deeper than he expected. Fight. That was what he knew how to do. Fight the land for crops, fight other men for honor, fight himself to keep from feeling too much. But to stop fighting, to let something happen that could undo the careful walls he had built, that was something he had never dared. He turned his face slightly, as if looking away might weaken the pull between them. But the memory of her standing in that dusty street weeks ago came back, as sharp as the moment itself. The sun blazing, the air heavy, and her eyes meeting his across the distance. He hadn't spoken to her then, but in that brief glance he had felt something stir, something he tried to silence. And now here she was, closer than he ever thought she would be, asking without words if he was ready to let go of all the things he held tight. He had a past, one he never spoke of. Loss that clung to him like smoke, scars that no one could see but weighed him down all the same. Nights spent alone with only the sound of the wind to remind him he was still alive. People had come and gone, some leaving marks deeper than he could bear, and he swore to himself he would never again let his heart fall into dangerous hands. It was easier to stay distant, to keep himself busy with work and silence. Until she came along and made silence feel unbearable. Her hand rested lightly against the table now, not touching him, but near enough that he could feel the space narrowing between them. He wanted to tell her about the weight he carried, about the promise he made to himself never to love again, but his throat stayed tight. She didn't need his words, though. She seemed to sense it already, as though she had seen through men like him before, men who fought battles no one else could see. The fire popped in the hearth, startling him enough to loosen his grip on the table. His knuckles ached from holding on too tightly, as if that wooden edge was the last thing keeping him steady. But deep down, he knew it wasn't the table he clung to. It was the past. It was the fear of what might happen if he let someone this close again. She leaned forward slightly, her breath brushing his skin, and his chest tightened. He wanted to step back, to put distance between them, but he couldn't move. The storm outside raged harder, wind howling through the cracks, and in that sound he heard an echo of himself untamed, restless, breaking against walls that could no longer hold. The look in her eyes told him she carried secrets, too. She had not come west for nothing. People didn't leave behind the lives they knew unless something drove them to. He had caught glimpses of it when she thought he wasn't watching, the way her gaze lingered too long on an empty chair, the way her smile faltered when laughter from the saloon drifted through town. There was loss behind her eyes, as sure as the loss in his own. It wasn't only desire pulling them together. It was the shared ache of wounds that had never healed. Two souls battered by different storms, now colliding in the middle of the same night. He knew that if he let this happen, there would be no going back. Hearts were fragile things in a land as harsh as theirs, and once broken again, they might never mend. The thunder cracked louder now, shaking the cabin. The lantern flickered low, threatening to go out. She didn't flinch, though. She stood steady, eyes locked on his, as if daring him to make the choice. He swallowed hard, his voice low when it finally came. "You don't know what you're asking of me." Her reply was almost a whisper, yet firm. "Maybe I do." Those words tore through him. If she truly understood the risk, the weight, then maybe she was braver than he had ever given her credit for. His breath came heavier, and he could feel his hands trembling again. This time not from fear alone, but from the force of everything inside him straining to be released. The cabin felt smaller by the second, the air thick enough to choke on. His heart pounded in his chest, and still he couldn't move. Part of him wanted to surrender, to give in to the pull that had been building since the moment he first laid eyes on her. But another part screamed for caution, for retreat, for silence. She waited, her patience unnerving, as if she knew time itself would drive him to a choice. The fire burned low, the shadows growing longer. The storm outside roared louder than before, but in the room, the silence stretched thin, ready to break. He closed his eyes for a moment, fighting to steady himself. Images from the past flooded his mind, faces he had lost, promises left unkept, graves marked only by simple wooden crosses. He thought of how much it hurt to bury the ones you loved, how dangerous it was to hold someone too close in a world where tomorrow was never certain. And yet, here he was, standing on the edge of letting himself fall again. When he opened his eyes, she was still there, closer than before. Her hand hovered in the space between them, not yet touching, but close enough to make his skin burn with anticipation. His chest rose and fell quickly now, his jaw clenched, his heart racing with every beat. The storm rattled the cabin with fury, but it was nothing compared to the storm inside him. He wanted to speak, to tell her to stop, to tell her to go before it was too late, but his voice betrayed him. The only sound that came was the sharp breath he drew as he realized there was no more room to run. The moment teetered on the edge of breaking, fragile and dangerous, with no clear way forward. He could feel it, the weight of choice pressing down on him, the pull of a future he could not yet see. And just as the lightning outside lit up the night, casting their faces in sudden brilliance, her hand finally moved. Her hand lingered between them, and for a moment time itself seemed to stretch thin, holding them both in a space where neither could move forward or back. The lantern glow caught the outline of her face, softening the lines of worry that years of hardship had carved there. He wanted to reach for her, yet his fingers curled into fists, locked by chains of memory that refused to break. The fire snapped behind them, and the storm outside bellowed like an angry beast. It felt as though the whole world was pressing in, forcing them toward a choice they weren't ready to make. The conflict in him was more than just desire fighting restraint. It was years of carrying ghosts that haunted him every time he closed his eyes. He had lived long enough on the frontier to know how quickly life could be taken. He had lost before, and the graves left behind were scars too deep for words. To open his heart again felt like gambling with the last pieces of himself he had left. And yet, here she was, standing in the quiet storm of his cabin, testing the walls he had built so carefully. She lowered her hand slowly, not touching him, but she didn't step away either. Instead, her voice cut through the silence, low and steady. "You're not the only one running from ghosts." The words pierced him sharper than a blade. He turned his eyes toward her, searching, though she kept her gaze firm. There was something in her tone, something that told him her past carried shadows as heavy as his. He wanted to ask, but fear held him back. He wasn't sure if he could bear hearing her story, not when he could barely carry his own. Still, the curiosity gnawed at him, the need to understand why fate had dragged her across his path in this lonely stretch of land. He shifted, his boots creaking against the floorboards. Then why come here? She hesitated, her lips parting as though words were ready but too heavy to release. Finally, she looked away, her eyes on the flames dancing in the hearth. Because some places are too full of memories, too full of faces you'll never see again. Her admission sank into the room like a stone dropped in water, rippling through the silence. He felt it deep in his chest, the truth of it. He too had left places behind, burying the past beneath miles of dust and distance. Yet no matter how far he traveled, the memories always followed. That was the curse of the living. You carried the dead with you whether you wanted to or not. The storm rattled the shutters, pulling his thoughts back to the present. He realized then that she wasn't just passing through. She had chosen to stay, at least for now, and that meant their lives were tied together whether he wanted them to be or not. The town was too small, the land too wide, for either of them to remain strangers. In the weeks leading up to this night, he had seen how the others in town watched her. Some with curiosity, some with suspicion. A woman traveling alone always drew whispers, and this town was no different. The saloon keeper had asked him more than once if he knew her story, but he kept his answer short, unwilling to fuel gossip. Still, he could feel the eyes on them whenever they crossed the street together, whenever she stopped by his wagon to ask about supplies or help with a broken hinge. The townsfolk were another storm he didn't want to face. They thrived on talk, and talk could ruin a person faster than drought or fire. He had lived quietly for years, avoiding entanglements, keeping to himself. Now her presence threatened to pull him back into the spotlight of suspicion and judgment. And part of him feared that was only the beginning. She finally turned back to him, her eyes searching again. "Do you trust me?" The question caught him off guard. His mouth opened, but no answer came. Trust was not something he gave freely. Out here, trust was more valuable than gold and just as easily stolen. He thought of all the times trust had betrayed him in the past, of how promises turned to dust. Yet something in her gaze held steady, refusing to let him turn away. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough. Her expression didn't falter. "Then maybe that's where we start." The words lingered between them, and he realized she wasn't asking for more than he could give. She wasn't demanding his heart, only a small step forward. Still, even that felt dangerous. But as the storm roared louder outside, he knew danger was already at their door. He thought of the rider he had seen earlier that day, a stranger on the ridge, watching the town from a distance before disappearing into the brush. Out here, strangers meant trouble more often than not. Whether it was bounty hunters, outlaws, or men chasing debts, danger had a way of finding lonely towns like theirs. And the thought gnawed at him now, what if the rider had been watching her, not the town? The idea unsettled him, though he didn't speak it aloud. Instead, he kept it buried, a worry for another time. But it sat in the back of his mind, building like thunder on the horizon. The fire burned lower and the lantern sputtered, dimming the room even more. She stepped back slightly, breaking the closeness between them, though her presence still filled the space. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, but the relief was short-lived. Distance didn't erase the pull between them. It only made it sharper, more insistent. His thoughts wandered to the land outside, the fields and the river that cut through the valley. He had carved a life there, quiet and steady, with no room for complications. Yet every choice he made now seemed tied to her, whether he wanted it or not. She was no passing shadow. She was the storm he had tried to avoid, and she wasn't going anywhere. The sound of hooves carried faintly through the storm, almost lost to the wind. He froze, head snapping toward the window. The sound was distant, but too real to ignore. His jaw tightened as he moved to the window, peering out into the black night. The rain blurred his vision, but he thought he saw movement in the trees. His pulse quickened. She moved closer, her voice low. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away, his eyes straining against the darkness. Finally, he turned, his face set. "We might not be alone tonight." Her expression hardened, and in that instant he saw something flash across her features: fear, yes, but also recognition. She knew something, though she didn't speak it. And that silence told him more than words ever could. The storm outside raged, but the storm inside the cabin had only begun. Both of them carried past too heavy to name, both of them bound by secrets that refused to stay buried. And now, with the sound of hooves echoing in the night, the fragile moment between them threatened to shatter. He felt his hands tremble again, but not from her closeness this time. This was the tremor of danger, of a man bracing for whatever might come crashing through his world. And deep down, he knew that what happened next would test them both in ways neither was ready to face. The storm hammered harder against the shutters, wind howling like a wounded beast across the plains. The faint thud of hooves had faded, but the sound lingered in his mind, an omen that refused to quiet. He stood at the window, watching the shadows shift outside, every nerve strung tight. Behind him, the fire gave off a low glow, and her presence pressed against him like the weight of something he couldn't ignore. She hadn't spoken since he warned her they might not be alone. The silence between them now was thicker than before, no longer born of unspoken longing but of a fear neither dared to name. He turned finally, and the lantern light revealed her face pale, eyes fixed on the door, lips pressed tight. That look told him what her words didn't. Whoever was out there wasn't a stranger to her. She knew, or at least suspected, who might have come. He crossed the room in slow, deliberate steps, boots heavy against the floorboards. His hand rested on the rifle leaning by the hearth, fingers curling around the worn wood. "If you know something, you need to tell me now," he said, his voice low, steady, but edged with urgency. Her gaze flickered to his, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then she drew in a breath, sharp and trembling. "There are men who don't forgive, men who don't let go." The words sank into him like cold iron. He had known enough of such men to understand what she meant. Outlaws, hunters, men driven by greed or revenge, it didn't matter the reason. Once they set their sights on something, they would burn the world down to take it. "Are they after you?" he asked, though the answer was already clear in the fear shadowing her eyes. She nodded faintly, her fingers clutching the edge of the table as though bracing herself. "I thought I left them behind. I thought the distance would keep me safe. But if they've found me—" Her voice trailed off, but she didn't need to finish. The silence filled in the rest. He ran a hand across his jaw, tension tightening every muscle in his body. His life had been built on solitude, on keeping his head low and his troubles fewer than the stars. Now hers had become his, whether he wanted them or not. And yet, when he looked at her, he knew he wouldn't turn her away. The storm outside masked any more sounds, but that didn't calm him. If men were out there waiting for the rain to pass, the cabin would soon become a trap. His chest tightened with the weight of choice. Stay and risk being surrounded, or move out into the storm where the land itself could turn against them. She stepped closer, her voice softer now. "You should have never let me in. I've brought this trouble to your door." He shook his head. "You didn't bring it." Trouble has a way of finding folks, whether they deserve it or not. His eyes held hers steady, unflinching. "What matters is what we do now." The fire cracked again, casting sparks, and for a moment the cabin seemed alive with tension, every sound amplified. He could feel the air between them charged not only with fear, but with the pull that had haunted him since the first night they met. The danger outside only sharpened it, reminding him how fragile time was, how quickly everything could be taken. She turned to the window then, her silhouette caught in the glow of the flames. "There were 3 of them the last time I saw them, brothers, mean as snakes. They won't stop until they've got what they came for." His grip on the rifle tightened. 3 men against 1 wasn't new to him, but the stakes now were different. This wasn't just his life. If they wanted her, they'd tear through him to get there. The storm rolled on, thunder shaking the cabin, but beneath the roar of nature he swore, he caught it again, the faint, uneven rhythm of hooves carried on the wind. Closer this time. He moved toward the door, heart pounding hard, but she reached out, catching his arm. Her hand was small, steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Don't go out there," she whispered. "That's what they want, to draw you into the open." Her touch burned through him, not with fire, but with something deeper, something that made his resolve waver. For a moment, the world narrowed to the warmth of her hand and the storm in her gaze. His heart stumbled, torn between the instinct to fight and the desire to protect her in a way he hadn't let himself feel for anyone in years. Lightning split the sky, flooding the cabin with white light before plunging it back into shadow. He could see her face in that flash, strong, determined, and yet carrying a sorrow that twisted at him. He wanted to ask her what the men wanted, why they wouldn't let her go, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't sure he wanted the answer, not now, not when danger pressed so close. The storm gave cover, but it wouldn't last forever. And when it broke, the real fight would begin. He knew it as sure as he knew the feel of his rifle in his hands. Every moment that passed was borrowed time, and the weight of it pressed on him until his chest felt like it might split. She finally released his arm, though her eyes didn't leave him. "If you stand with me, they'll come for you too. They won't stop at me. They'll destroy anyone who helps." He stepped closer, his voice rough but steady. "Then let them come. I've faced worse than shadows in the rain." Her lips parted as if to answer, but the sound outside cut her short. a sharp crack wood splitting under force. Not thunder this time. Something had struck. The front gate, maybe, or the fence post. His heart kicked hard against his ribs, and he raised the rifle, stepping toward the door with slow, deliberate movements. She stayed close behind, her breath quick, her presence steady despite the fear hanging thick in the air. Every creak of the cabin, every howl of wind, seemed louder now, as though the world itself was bracing for what was about to unfold. The night outside felt alive, the storm masking whatever moved in the dark. He could almost feel the eyes watching, waiting for their chance. His hand trembled slightly as he tightened his grip on the rifle, but it wasn't fear alone. It was the weight of knowing everything was about to break open. Behind him, she whispered something, so faint he almost didn't catch it. A prayer, maybe, or a plea. He didn't ask. His eyes stayed on the door, his ears straining for the next sound. The thunder rolled again, and this time, beneath it, he swore he heard voices. Low, muffled, carried by the storm, men's voices. He exchanged a glance with her, and in that single look, the truth was clear. They weren't waiting. They were coming. His chest heaved, his pulse racing. The cabin that had once been his refuge was now the heart of a storm not even the land could swallow. She stood behind him. Her shadow stretched long against the wall, and he realized with stark clarity that everything he had kept locked away was now at stake. The next strike against the gate echoed louder, splintering wood under force. They were close now, closer than he had feared. His finger brushed the trigger, every sense alive, every thought tangled between survival and the woman standing behind him. The storm screamed outside, the fire hissed in the hearth, and the cabin trembled with the weight of what was about to break through its walls. And in that breathless moment, balanced between silence and chaos, he knew the night was rushing toward a point of no return. The gate finally gave way with a heavy crack, the sound echoing through the storm as wood splintered and the night swallowed the last layer of protection. He raised the rifle, his chest burning with every breath, and braced himself for the figures that emerged from the rain. 3 men stepped out of the dark, shadows with faces made harsher by the lantern glow spilling from the cabin. Their voices carried over the thunder, sharp and taunting, cutting through the roar of the wind. She stood behind him, her hand clenched at her side, her face pale but steady. He could feel her fear, but there was also something stronger beneath it, a determination that made him realize she had been preparing for this moment for far longer than he had. These men weren't strangers to her. They were the ghosts she had been running from, the reason her steps had led her into his life. The standoff stretched long, every second drawn tight as a bowstring. He knew the odds, 3 against 1, but he also knew the land, the cabin, and the will to protect what mattered. When the first man stepped forward, his voice mocking, the rifle answered with a single crack that drowned even the thunder. The fight that followed was quick, fierce, and raw, born from desperation as much as survival. When it was over, the storm seemed quieter, the night less suffocating. 2 of the men lay still in the mud outside, the third stumbling into the darkness, wounded and defeated, his threat swallowed by the rain. The cabin stood scarred but unbroken, its walls marked by the violence that had tested them both. He lowered the rifle slowly, his hands still trembling, his body heavy with exhaustion. She stepped closer, her breath uneven, her eyes fixed on him as if she were seeing him for the first time. There was no victory in her gaze, only relief and sorrow tangled together. She whispered her thanks, but he shook his head, because thanks felt too small a word for what had just passed between them. They hadn't just survived a night of violence, they had survived the weight of choices, the collision of past and present, the breaking of walls they had built around their hearts. He leaned against the table, his shoulders sagging, and she moved to his side, steadying him with a hand against his arm. For a moment neither spoke. The fire burned low, the storm began to ease, and in that stillness they both understood that the danger had not been the only battle fought. They had faced themselves, their ghosts, and the truths they had been too afraid to name. In the days that followed, the town buzzed with whispers. Folks spoke of gunfire in the storm, of strangers who had come with dark intent and met their end at the edge of the valley. Some asked questions, others kept their distance, but no one pressed too hard. The West had always been a place where secrets lived, and most people learned it was wiser not to dig too deep. For her, the whispers were both a burden and a release. She no longer had to fear the brothers who had chased her across miles of dust and sorrow. Their hold on her life was broken, but the memories they left behind would not vanish so easily. He saw the weight she still carried, the way her eyes sometimes drifted to the horizon as if expecting more shadows to appear. Yet he also saw something new, a spark of hope that had been missing when she first stepped into town. For him, the fight had awakened something he thought he had buried for good. He had lived years in solitude, convinced that distance was the only way to keep himself safe from loss. But when the storm tested him, it wasn't solitude that carried him through. It was the bond forged in quiet glances, in unspoken truths, in the decision to stand beside her when he could have turned away. He realized then that walls might protect a man from pain, but they also robbed him of everything worth living for. The land healed slowly after the storm. The fields drank deep from the rain, the river swelled with new life, and the air smelled fresher than it had in months. The cabin bore its scars, but it stood as strong as ever, a testament to survival and resilience. So too did they. Though neither spoke of the night often, it lingered between them, shaping the way they looked at each other, the way they walked together through town, the way silence no longer felt like an enemy but a companion. There were moments when he still woke in the dark, his heart pounding with echoes of gunfire and thunder, but she was there now, steadying him with her quiet presence. And there were moments when she faltered, her eyes shadowed by memories of men who had once controlled her life, but he was there, grounding her with the strength of his hand, the weight of his silence, the promise of something steady in a world that often felt like shifting sand. Their story was not one of sudden miracles or easy answers. It was a story of endurance, of two souls carrying scars and learning to bear them together. The West was harsh, unforgiving, and uncertain, but within it they had found something rare, a chance to begin again, not as the people they had been, but as the people they could become. As the weeks turned into months, the town grew used to seeing them side by side. The gossip faded, replaced by quiet respect, the kind given to those who had faced storms and survived. The cabin became more than a shelter. It became a home, its walls no longer echoing with loneliness but alive with the quiet rhythms of shared life. The fire that once burned low for one now warmed two, and the silence that had once suffocated now carried the weight of comfort. There were still challenges, as there always were on the frontier. Drought would come, crops would fail, men would test their strength against the land and each other. But whatever came, they faced it together, no longer bound by the fear of loss but strengthened by the choice to trust. Looking back, he often thought of the moment when his hands trembled as she reached for the ties of her dress, the moment when he whispered for help in a voice he didn't mean to release. At the time, it felt like weakness, like the cracking of the walls he had depended on for so long. But in the end, it was not weakness at all. It was the beginning of strength he hadn't known he still carried, the strength to let someone in, to fight not just for himself but for something greater. She too looked back on that night, not with regret, but with the quiet understanding that it had changed everything. The ghosts of her past had followed her across the land, but they no longer held her captive. She had found not just safety, but a place where she could belong, a place where the weight of her story was not too heavy to bear. The plains stretched wide around them, endless and wild, a reminder that life was never without risk. But as they stood together at the edge of the land, Watching the sun dip low and the sky burn with colors too rich for words, they knew the storms that came would not break them. They had already faced the worst of the night, and they had come through not as two wandering souls, but as something more. The West would always whisper of danger, of loss, of the harshness of a land that spared no one. But it also whispered of resilience, of love forged in fire and storm, of hearts that found each other when the world least expected it. And in that truth, their story found its end, not in despair, but in the quiet, enduring strength of two people who chose to keep walking forward, hand in hand, into whatever lay beyond the horizon.